We have breaking news tied to President Trump's push to give himself more control over America's elections. A federal judge has just blocked key pieces of Trump's 2025 executive order on elections, specifically banning Trump from requiring people to show proof of citizenship in order to vote. MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin is here. Tim O'Brien is still with us. The judge, Lisa, says this is a separation of powers issue. Tell us more.
Well, Alicia, under the Constitution, most control over elections is given to the states. And part of what the president was trying to do here through this executive order was commandeer for himself the right to decide how elections are administered in states. This is a judge that previously had granted a preliminary injunction or a block on most of the provisions that were challenged here. But here, she's now making it more permanent and saying that what Trump has tried to do through this executive order doesn't just pose a separation of challenge problem. It's unlawful under existing federal law that protects, for example, people who live overseas and are part of our military. It is inconsistent with aspects of the law that protect their right to vote. One of the reasons why is because it authorized the Attorney General to prosecute states that were counting ballots received after Election Day, even if they were postmarked by or before Election Day. That's an issue that's live right now before the Supreme Court, right? But Trump was also trying to take matters into his own hands, and through this executive order, direct the Attorney General to actually commence prosecutions of states that have this as part of their policy. 13 states that allow this were among the plaintiffs who sued against this executive order to try and block its enforcement. So today, the chief judge of a federal court in Massachusetts saying in a 59-page ruling, you may not do this. You may not take for yourself the right to decide how elections are administered in this country and say that the national voter registration form or the postcard used for military members to register, that they have to include documentary proof of citizenship before we will allow you to vote.
So what happens next?
I think the preliminary injunction that was already issued is on appeal, but that argument is not even scheduled until after the election. So today's ruling doesn't change the state of play necessarily going into the November election. But this is kind of a Tetris piece that is moving with respect to other things. I just mentioned that Supreme Court case, the Watson case, in which the whole question is whether or not allowing the counting after Election Day interferes with another federal law that defines Election Day as a particular Tuesday in November. So you've got, I think, this particular case will continue to move in ways that don't impact the election. But the larger and broader issue about do states have to turn over voter rolls so that the national government can determine whether somebody is a citizen, or can we count particular ballots after Election Day, even if they're voted before, those issues remain very live in related litigation and in related policies.
I was about to say, they remain alive in the litigation. They remain alive on Capitol Hill right now, where the president was willing to torpedo a housing bill because he wants Senate Republicans to pass the Save America Act. They recognize it is rife with problems. It is not popular with the American people. The Postmaster General is on the Hill today and is going to have to answer questions about the administration's using USPS in order to tinker with American elections. They won't back off of this.
Using a federal agency essentially to override the Constitution, to pick up on a point that Lisa made, which is that states run elections. The federal government doesn't. The Constitution didn't give the president and the executive branch any special prominence over elections. And I think Trump is trying to seed the water here, not only to interfere with voter turnout on Election Day, which is why all these machinations are happening around direct mail and other issues pertaining to the midterms. It's that he wants to create the idea that there's malfeasance, that there are illegal acts going on, because the federal government is allowed to insert itself in state electoral processes if there's evidence of malfeasance. And some of that historically has come out of the civil rights movement, when the federal government got involved with protecting black voters in the South to make sure that their ability to vote was protected. That's a very positive side of federal intervention. The negative side is if you have someone in the Oval Office who is a tyrant and wants to overturn the law and can invoke malfeasance as a way to get into different states during the midterms where he wants to meddle with the vote.
I mean, it would help explain why you don't want to pass legislation that would actually be popular in November.
Totally.
2 minutes ago, We were all supposed to be down in the rotunda while Donald Trump signed it into law. But Trump has now said, nope, he's not going to do that. You know what that says to me? It says to me that Donald Trump just doesn't care about the cost squeeze on American families. This is the guy who said affordability is a made-up word that Democrats came up with. Affordability is a hoax. He said about inflation, he loves the inflation. Yeah, he does. He doesn't care about high prices for millions of people across this country.
Hi, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. It is a bigger mess than usual in Donald Trump's Washington, D.C. right now. We're not just talking about the mess he's made of the reflecting pool. 17 months into Trump 2.0, and Donald Trump is more detached from reality and out of touch politically than ever before, as his priorities veer further and further away from what Americans, including the vast majority of his own voters, say they want by the day. Earlier today, as the senator was alluding to, Donald Trump torpedoed a chance to show Americans that he doesn't actually think affordability is a hoax made up by Democrats. He canceled a bill signing that was meant to champion a landmark bipartisan piece of affordable housing legislation, and he did it just 2 hours before that ceremony was supposed to begin. He did it to demand legislation to make it harder for the American people to vote. Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social, quote, "Today's housing news conference and signing is hereby canceled until such time as we pass the desperately needed Save America Act, which I consider to be a national emergency." It was followed by 2 pictures of the reflecting pool. It was so weird and last minute that even Republicans were caught flat-footed. They were in the middle of a press conference where they were publicly in front of the press championing the bill and applauding Donald Trump for his help in getting it passed. It caused the ever-loyal House Speaker Mike Johnson to actually voice some exasperation with his dear leader, Donald Trump. Watch that.
I talked to him about it this morning, an hour before he made that announcement. I convinced him that I thought the housing was his priorities and was good policy.
He's not making life easier for his guys. You guys are going to have a big signing.
I brought it to
We're doing our job. Speaker Johnson is just the latest Republican, though, to let his exasperation with Donald Trump spill into public view as Donald Trump delivers today's unforced error. The 4 Republicans breaking with their colleagues yesterday and voting on a resolution directing an end to Donald Trump's deeply unpopular war in Iran, a war which is causing some to defect from Donald Trump's political party entirely. Earlier this week, Marjorie Taylor Greene did just that. She announced that she is joining Tucker Carlson in his decision to leave the GOP. It is in no small part because of Donald Trump's war with Iran. It's a trend that is likely to continue as new polling shows just how deeply unpopular that war is with the American people. As we reported last hour, less than a quarter of Americans, 24%, believe the war with Iran has been worth the costs. Just 34% of Americans approve of Donald Trump's handling of his presidency overall. What would be a 5-alarm fire for any normal president seems unlikely to break through with Donald Trump, who instead posted this on Truth Social in all caps, quote, "My real poll numbers are the highest they have ever been. Thank you, President DJD." Donald Trump's completely delusional presidency, causing even Speaker Mike Johnson to flee, is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Puck News senior political columnist and national affairs analyst John Heilman is back. Also back with us, Media Matters for America President Angelo Carasone and managing editor of The Bulwark, contributor Sam Stein is here. Sam, first of all, can you add any reporting to our understanding as to how Mike Johnson, of all people, who seems to have wired his own little bat phone inside the Oval Office for like a game of Simon Says or Mother May I, how did he end up in cross signals with Donald Trump?
Well, from our understanding, this was totally out of the blue. And it wasn't just Mike Johnson who was caught off guard. There were actual members of Donald Trump's staff who even minutes, hours before the signing ceremony was set to take place were boasting about the bill signing and the legislation, the housing legislation that was going to pass, talking about how it's going to bring great financial relief to people who are looking to buy a home. And so this is sort of a classic Trump move where when there was no drama, he demands that it be inserted. Where the spotlight would have been on a lot of legislators, he demands the spotlight be on himself. And I would just add one element to this because I think this is really rankling a lot of lawmakers on the Hill on the Republican side of things. It's not just the excessive drama and the just torpedoing of this piece of legislation. It's the monomaniacal insistence on getting the Save America Act, the SAVE Act, passed into law and using whatever parliamentary means are possible to do so. Now, there are no parliamentary means possible to do so. They'd have to blow up the filibuster. And he's insistent on this. And it's causing a lot of consternation and frustration among lawmakers on the Hill. So when Johnson was fleeing there, the questions were about the housing, but what they really were about is the SAVE Act. The House has passed it, the Senate cannot do it. And Donald Trump is demanding essentially everything come to a halt in order for that to pass. And I will just say, I think this is in some ways the more important story here, because Donald Trump has basically made it doctrine for 30% of the country that our elections are fraudulent. It's no longer just him spouting off conspiracies and everyone entertaining them. People now legitimately believe that our elections, which there's been no proof that there's widespread corruption in our elections, 30% of the country at least believe that this is the case. And because of that, they are willing to hold hostage basic legislative processes, including widely bipartisan bills to provide financial relief to American public. And it's causing people like Mike Johnson to basically rip their hair out in the most polite possible way that Mike Johnson can do so without offending Donald Trump.
Well, the problem, I guess, politically then is that 30% of the country believing their delusional lies. First of all, it says something about the lack of intelligence of the 30%, because how does Donald Trump win 2 of the last 3 elections if the elections are so corrupt, right? I mean, the left has done a terrible job corrupting and corrupting our elections if Trump won 2 of the last 3 contests. But 30% of the electorate is not enough to hang on to really many of the seats if the size of the political wave that is heading their way is to be believed from Republicans. I want to read you, Heilman, what Republicans are saying. This is a Republican Senate staffer who says, quote, "We saw glimpses of this during Trump's first administration, but never in my lifetime have I seen a president so deliberately attempt to lose majorities for his own party," the Republican aide told our Capitol Hill reporter.
Yeah, Nicole, I was going to say that 30% doesn't win you a seat anywhere in the country. You might. I'm not trying to say that that you can't put together a bunch of in safe seats. You can't put together. You eventually get to 50+1. But I mean, the number of people who believe what Sam correctly cites is not enough. And the problem for Donald Trump is that number has stopped moving in any way. To the extent that there was a base underneath Donald Trump, it has been eroding. Maybe not it's not crumbling, it's not completely falling apart, but all you need is a little bit of that. When you combine it with the absolutely devastating numbers that Republicans are seeing with independent voters, and I'll say I've spoken the last 72 hours to a strategist in Georgia, a strategist in Kansas, and a strategist. Where's the third one from? There was a third one that I talked to in a Senate race. All of whom are seeing. In Texas. All of whom are seeing Republicans in their focus groups open to the idea of voting for the Democratic candidate for Senate in those races. Now, Georgia is a democratically held seat. John Ossoff is a very strong candidate. Obviously, Texas is going to be an hugely important race. Kansas is not a race that's currently on anybody's radar, but there are people out there who will tell you that they think it's not impossible in the right year with the candidate the Democrats are, who's likely to win the primary there, who's the largest preacher the largest has the largest congregation, a United Methodist preacher out there. That in the right year with the right candidate, it's not impossible. There is a Democratic governor in Kansas now, so it's not impossible. And you're starting to hear the signs there among Republicans who are getting frustrated, not just in the political class, but voters who are fed up with this. And the last thing I'll say, is that there's the most important thing that's said in this entire exchange is the part of Trump's post where he says the phrase national emergency. And I think that when you start to think about what all of this is about, Sam's correct focus on the SAVE Act piece of this is that Donald Trump is starting to broadcast his strategy for interfering with, intervening in, and trying to steal the 2026 election, something that we've talked a lot about on the show over the course of many, many months. But national emergency is a phrase that you should remember, because I think we're going to start to see it more and more in Donald Trump communications, both on social media and in his language when he talks about these things on the stump. That is how you get to a justification for starting to seize control of the election apparatus and mechanisms and means by which we hold elections. National emergency. He said it right there. I think we're going to hear it again.
There's a lot of people that have a lot of negative stuff to say. There's a lot of people who have a lot of opinions. But when you prove them wrong, you really don't have to say to them.
That video clip is what New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani posted in the wake of a stunningly successful primary night for a slate of candidates he endorsed. In the lead up to the primary, the mayor made a risky move, backing 3 congressional candidates against the pull power of not just the Democratic Party, but really the institutional progressive movement of New York City. 2 of the candidates primaried sitting Democratic incumbents, which is risky. Last night, all 3 of those candidates won. As the New York Times put it in Sunday's headline, quote, Mamdani burns allies in making a big bet for Congress and the left. But as of this morning, it looks like the bet paid off. Joining me now is New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, who will be speaking with House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries later tonight. Mayor, congrats. I know my colleague Jen Psaki has leader Jeffries on the next hour to discuss what's going on. What are you looking for in your conversation with leader Jeffries tonight?
I appreciate the relationship that I have with Leader Jeffries, and it's one where we're united in looking to deliver for the people of the city. And as you heard from him, we have disagreements about endorsements. And I think you mentioned a number of those candidates that I was proud to endorse, and Daria Lisa Avila Chevalier and Claire Valdez and Brad Lander. And also, at the end of the day, what we're looking to do is to deliver for the working people of New York City. And I think last night we heard from New Yorkers a hunger for exactly that kind of work being done here in our city.
Obviously, I'm a lifelong New Yorker, know New York politics well. I should disclose that my brother actually worked on the Lander campaign, which I basically didn't cover for that reason in the run-up to this entire race. When you're in your race, I think you could really say, you had a laser focus on affordability. You really did. You were very on message. Interviews where I tried to push you off the message, you kept coming back to it. You know what you're doing. I think it's much harder to make that argument about these wins last night. I covered these races pretty closely. I followed them. They weren't really about affordability. I don't think you can say there was some big difference between Claire Valdez and Antonio Reynoso. So what were they about from your perspective?
I think they were about clarity. They were about conscience. They were about conviction. And what I mean by that is when you're walking the streets with Claire, one of the things that she speaks often about is the importance of fighting income inequality and how the most effective tool to do so is increasing union density. And she knows that because she's somebody who rose through the union movement, rose through UAW. And this is somebody who has also made clear time and time again that we need to have a foreign policy that is not, as Daria Lisa would put it, investing in bombs as opposed to in babies. And I think what you've seen from New Yorkers, whether it's in Brad's race, Daria Lisa's race, or Claire's race, is an exhaustion with status quo politics and a desire for something that actually responds to the needs that they have in their own districts. In some of these districts we're talking about, especially in Daria Lisa's case, this is one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States of America. The other night when I was walking with her through Harlem, we met a man coming out of a bodega who had his hands full with Huggies that he just bought. And in that same moment, she and I are having a conversation about how our government has spent more than $30 billion in bombs for the Israeli military to kill civilians, whether in Palestine or in Lebanon. And it just speaks to what New Yorkers are tired of and what they want to see. They want to see people who are willing to not just stand up to the federal administration, but also stand for a vision of working people at the heart of it.
There's a lot of folks, I would say, in New York who, let's say broadly in sort of pro-Israel coalition, I think that's how they would describe themselves, who view last night as about that single issue. Basically, what they will say is, particularly if you look at Goldman and Lander, like, this was really about Israel, and it was motivated by people's feelings about Israel. And I think the pro-Israel folks would say, you know, their anger, their rage. Some even say it's anti-Semitism. I don't necessarily sign on to that, but do you think it was, like, fundamentally, is that what it was about the people and the Democratic Party supporting fundamentally or not doing enough to oppose the actions of the Israeli government over the last several years and continuing actions in Gaza?
I think that played a major role. And it played a major role because New Yorkers have had to watch as tens of billions of our tax dollars have been spent on bombs that not only shred international law, but also the lives of civilians. And what they've seen is that while it is a Republican administration that is doing it now, it was also something that was bipartisan and continues to be. And I think there is a desire to see a politics of life be at the center of what we are fighting for. And, you know, I think if you're looking at Brad and his race and his candidacy, he led with such a humanity and in many ways an embodiment of what Mr. Rogers would speak about in the actions of a good neighbor. And he would speak about the fact that he is going to Congress not only to fight against bigotry, whether it be anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, but also to make clear that he is going to fight against the occupation, against the genocide. He's going to co-sponsor, as well as Claire Valdez and Daria Lisa will, the Block the Bombs Act to stop our federal government from sending those kinds of shipments to the Israeli military. And I think that's what's in line with what so many New Yorkers are desperate to see. And all of this is all the more difficult for a New Yorker to accept when at the same time they're having trouble affording life in the nation's most expensive city. At the same time as we're greenlighting tens of billions of dollars for Netanyahu's wars, we're being told, sorry, we just can't help you make it a little bit easier to afford your rent check or your groceries or your childcare or even your public transit. And I think that what we saw is that New Yorkers were fed up with a status quo of our politics where we're stuck explaining why this is the best we're going to have, as opposed to advocating for the working person who's being left behind by that same status quo.
I just feel duty-bound to point out the federal government budget is like trillions of dollars, depending whether you account for security. So in the grand scheme of things, I mean, you're right. There's been about $30 billion to Israel. There's lots and lots of billions of dollars that could be found for those things, even if we were to continue. In doing this, you clearly ticked off a bunch of people. You knew that. I mean, they weren't like shy about saying it, because generally the way it goes is you don't endorse against incumbents. Yeah, it really is kind of the unwritten rule in this. Tish James, who was a very vocal backer of yours when you were running for mayor, and even a backer of yours when I think it was pretty politically controversial to be so, had this to say. She said she and other political leaders she's spoken to are disappointed in Zohran Mamdani. All of us are a little frustrated with the Democratic Party, but you don't blow it up. That's what MAGA has done. What do you say to that?
I think, what is the Democratic Party if not its voters? And what we saw yesterday evening were Democrats across the city turning out and voting for a new kind of politics. And I've been clear time and time again that I believe the only majority in our country is that of the working class. And what we saw is that a focus on the working class, whether it's from Claire, whether it's from Daria Lisa, whether it's from Brad, is the kind of focus that New Yorkers want to see. And I have a deep amount of respect for my friend Attorney General James, and I also believe that these are the kinds of candidates that we need to see in Congress, as well as the 5 state legislative candidates that I endorsed that also won yesterday evening, if we want to truly fulfill the affordability agenda. And, you know, as I'm speaking to you, Chris, it marks 1 year since I won the nomination to become the Democratic nominee for mayor of our city. And I made a promise to New Yorkers that I'd use every tool at my disposal to actually transform the city into one that they could afford. And one of those tools is using your political capital to ensure that the people who will fight hardest for that same agenda are going to be there, whether it's in Albany or whether it's in D.C. And I'm so excited to say that in yesterday's 8 different campaigns that we endorsed, we saw 8 different victories for exactly that same message.
On that point about the working class, and I just want to be clear here, like, you win, right? Like, these were winning, like, all 8 won, and different winning candidates assemble different winning coalitions, particularly in primaries. But it also is the case, and you can go down to the census tract level, or you can look at the different parts where there is a correlation between the success of the candidates you backed and higher degrees of college education attainment and even higher degrees of household income in those areas, right? I mean, you can run the numbers. The Times had them today. In the Bronx, which I know pretty well, my home borough, Daria Lisa was lost by 30 points to the incumbent Adriana Espaillat in that part of the borough, which is a very poor part of the borough. What do you say to people who say this is fundamentally democratic socialism, a kind of college affectation, that basically, like, you talk about the working class, but really it's just a bunch of people who just got out of some college seminar who like to talk socialism?
Well, I think that everyone has their narratives. What I'll tell you is I'm excited to be able to speak to you as someone who won more than 1 million votes in last year's election here in New York City. And what we saw is that we got those votes across New York City and across so many of the different demographics that make up our city. And when we're speaking about Daria Lisa, who will be the first Afro-Latina Dominican woman to represent that district, she would not be able to win that nomination without the support of communities of color. And the same thing with Claire Valdez, who will be the first Mexican-American and indigenous woman to represent that district. She would not be there winning by 20 points if it was not also for the support of voters of color. And I think too often what happens after a race is an attempt to explain why that result happened, as opposed to listen to the voters who cast their ballot in that way. And what I heard from many voters is they do want a different kind of politics. And especially for all of the conversation of 2028 and where this party should go, I think it's wise to listen to voters about exactly what kind of politics they want to see. It's one that is much closer to what we used to see from our party in the days of FDR than what we've seen in a time when our only vision seems to be a responsive one to Trump, as opposed to one that goes beyond that.
FDR, if you ever read a biography, both charming and ruthless, an interesting combination. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for having me.
And now Republican senators are yelling at Donald Trump. And that hasn't happened in 10 years.
Here's the guy that inherited $200 million. If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
The man Donald Trump used to call Little Marco is now his Secretary of State. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spent the day in Kuwait negotiating with representatives of regional governments that have suffered during Donald Trump's war with Iran. And here's what Donald Trump said about Marco Rubio's negotiating skills.
Marco is not a negotiator. I watched him melt down, and I'll tell you, it was one of the saddest things I've ever seen. He's not going down.
He thinks the Palestinian is a real estate deal.
And these people may even be tougher than Chris Christie, okay?
The Palestinians are not a real estate deal, Donald.
Okay, no. A deal,
They're not a real estate deal.
A deal is a deal. Let me tell you,
a deal is not a deal when you're dealing with terrorists. Have you ever negotiated with terrorists?
You are not a negotiator. And with your thinking, you will never bring peace. You will never bring peace.
Donald might be able to.
So Marco Rubio will never bring peace, according to Donald Trump. And American voters agree with Donald Trump on that. A new poll shows 63% say that Donald Trump's agreement with Iran will not lead to lasting peace. Since Donald Trump defeated every Republican senator running against him for the Republican nomination for president 10 years ago, not one Republican senator has ever dared to yell at Donald Trump ever again. Until today. The New York Times is calling it a shouting match. And it happened in a place where you usually never hear a raised voice. Senators meet in two different conference rooms close to the Senate floor for group lunches in which the Democrats all gather together in one conference room and Republicans all gather together in another conference room to discuss their Senate priorities over sandwiches sent in from the Senate dining room. Very few Senate staffers are ever allowed in those meetings. In my last couple of years of working in the Senate, I reached the staff level that is actually allowed in that room, and I saw actual shouting in the room exactly once for about 30 seconds between two Democratic senators who were otherwise very friendly before and after that moment. Most people in the room said later that they'd never seen anyone shouting in that room, and that included people, senators, who'd been going to lunch in that room for 30 years. Today, the shouting match was in the Republican Senate luncheon. And in a typical week, many senators don't bother to show up for those luncheons, but when an important guest is invited, that increases attendance. Today, Republicans were lunching with their most important possible guest, the President of the United States, and it was the most mild-mannered among them who found himself in a shouting match with Donald Trump because yesterday that senator voted, along with 3 other Republican and the Democratic senators, to help pass a war powers resolution limiting Donald Trump's ability to wage war in Iran. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy has been voting against Donald Trump's war since Senator Cassidy lost his reelection campaign against a Trump-endorsed Republican primary challenger in Louisiana. Most of the newly brave opposition to Donald Trump on the Republican side of the United States Senate comes from Republicans who are in their final year in the Senate by choice or because Donald Trump defeated them in their reelection campaigns and Republican primaries with Trump-endorsed candidates. Last week, Senator Bill Cassidy said this after reading the 4-page memo of understanding Donald Trump signed with Iran.
So I think we had a really great meeting, and we're very proud of the party.
The details that I've seen so far look awful. This will go down as a tremendous foreign policy blunder. Iran ends up stronger. Our allies in the region are weaker. And Iran has learned that if they're willing to grab that Strait of Hormuz and choke it off, they can get the Western world to dance to their tune. I think it's a deep mistake.
Okay, so the first bit of that video that you saw that was out of sequence with what we were showing you was Donald Trump lying about today's meeting after the meeting, which was not a good meeting at all. And according to Senator Cassidy's modest account of his shouting match with Donald Trump, the account that Senator gave to reporters right after the luncheon, he didn't say anything as harsh or strong as what we just heard him say last week about Donald Trump's Iran deal. But it obviously doesn't take much to get Donald Trump shouting. And Senator Cassidy said that once Donald Trump was shouting, he, quote, matched his tone and his volume, end quote. Senator Cassidy spoke briefly to reporters after the luncheon where no video cameras were present, and he said this.
He asked, why would anybody vote for the War Powers Act? As he continued, I said, is that a rhetorical question, or would you like to really know? He said, I'd like to know. I stood and said, you have not told the American people what's going on. It was supposed to last 4 weeks. It's lasted 4 months. Our original objectives have not been achieved. And I want to know what's going on. I can't tell you that's verbatim, because obviously I was speaking. But that's kind of what I've been saying all along. I'm voting for war powers until I get a briefing. At which point, as I recall, he did not particularly care for my comments. Raised his voice. I lost my temper. That's not appropriate. It's the Irish in me. But I, again, matched his tone and his volume, and it went back and forth. But at some point, my guy sitting next to me, I'll sit down. And so I sat down and tried to de-escalate. I guess my point is, though, that the American people need to know more than we are being told. The Senate needs to know. And it does not appear, although I don't know for sure, that the course of this is going the way that we were told. And so I make no apologies for standing up to the president, if you will, trying to demand that more information be shared with the Senate and more information be shared with the American people. I make no apologies for that, whatever. And if someone tries to bully me into not asking that question, I'm not going to accept that either. I am sticking up for the American people, even if I'm speaking to the president.
When the president raised his voice at you, what did he say? Did he insult you? Or?
You know, something like, you know, what does President Trump say? You know, oh, you lost the election, that sort of thing. You know, whatever, you know, comes to mind as to demean another person.
The New York Times reports this about the uncouth, vulgarian Donald Trump. Mr. Trump also lashed out at Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican of Alaska, who was part of the bloc of Republicans that supported the resolution, calling her a horrible person, according to senators in attendance. In not one of the reports about what happened in that room did a single senator rise to say, no, she's not, when Donald Trump called Lisa Murkowski a horrible person. And so they remain the weakest collection of people in Washington history who bear the title senator. Our first guest tonight, whose service as a senator included being the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was never afraid to tell a president that his war was a failure. John Kerry's first appearance in the United States Senate was as a leader of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War when he testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the committee he would eventually become chairman of, about the horrors of combat in Vietnam that he participated in and the impossibility of the United States ever winning that war. John Kerry's testimony that day helped end the Vietnam War sooner than it would have without his unique voice in protest against that war. John Kerry's opposition to that war helped end the draft and to spare the lives of young American men who were therefore never sent to die in that war. As President Obama's Secretary of State, he continued what can be seen as his lifetime commitment to trying to save us from war by negotiating the most important diplomatic breakthrough of the 21st century, the agreement with Iran, supported by 5 other countries, that Iran would never develop or acquire a nuclear weapon. That agreement was working exactly as intended, with Iran's full, obedient compliance, when Donald Trump, for absolutely no reason, abandoned the agreement. As soon as Donald Trump did that, Iran began immediately enriching nuclear material for the possible production of nuclear weapons, something Iran had completely stopped doing thanks to the agreement negotiated by John Kerry and enforced by international inspectors who were allowed to go anywhere in Iran to find out exactly what Iran was doing, with the full support of 5 other countries who joined that agreement: China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the European Union, all supporting that inspections regime that John Kerry negotiated. Donald Trump is now trying to do something alone through war that John Kerry did with the most important allies in the world through diplomacy. Unfortunately, for the United States and the world, no one with John Kerry's experience and expertise is involved in the current negotiations with Iran.
If you watched any of Trump's great American state fair tonight, I mean, I'm sorry for you, I guess, but you might have thought you were just watching a Trump rally. Well, the 16-day event bills itself as a free, nonpartisan celebration of America's 250th birthday with no ulterior motives. Nobody supposed to be benefiting aside from the American people. That's clearly not the case. I mean, just to put a fine point on it, tonight's festivities were produced, at least in part, by the production company behind Trump's rally at the Ellipse on January 6th. A company that the New York Times reports has received millions of dollars worth of no-bid contracts since Trump retook office. And it is just one of the now multiple companies the Times reports has received no-bid contracts from the Trump administration related to the country's 250th birthday. Now, for anyone out there thinking, well, doesn't it make sense for the government to celebrate the country's 250th birthday? Yeah, of course it does. The country should be celebrating. That is why a decade ago, Congress created a nonpartisan nonprofit called America 250 to help plan and produce a celebration. But this isn't that group. You see, the Trump administration decided to make their own group. Instead of America 250, this group is confusingly called Freedom 250. And it is Freedom 250 that just so happened to hire the firm from Trump's January 6th Ellipse rally. It is Freedom 250 that decided the academic institution it should partner with for this celebration of American history was the unaccredited right-wing evangelical group. It is Freedom 250 that is holding tonight's rally on the National Mall, headlined by Trump himself. And all of these pro-Trump, pro-MAGA festivities are costing quite a lot of money. Some of that money is coming from private donors. As the New York Times reports, Freedom 250 got some of its fund by offering perks to private sponsors. Of course they did. For $500,000, sponsors could get their logo featured at Freedom 250 events. For $1 million, sponsors got access to Trump himself. But of course, a lot of these festivities are being paid for with your tax dollars. The nonprofit watchdog groups, the Revolving Door Project and Public Citizen, have tracked nearly $103 million worth of public contracts and grants from the Trump administration to what the groups describe as, quote, a network of politicized entities under the control of Trump administration officials and political allies. There we go. All under the guise of America's 250th birthday. Joining me now is Democratic Senator from Georgia, Jon Ossoff. Good to see you.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So tonight was technically the kickoff of America 250, and I think a lot of people feel two realities right now. One, pride in being an American, pride in being in this great country, and the other reality is watching the President of the United States essentially make money from this celebration, make it about himself, help benefit people who owe him favors. How do you not square, but how do you think about these two realities?
Well, I think it's a call to action for patriotic Americans to recognize that at the 250th anniversary of our country's founding in rejection of kingdom and monarchy, we have these events being hijacked by the narcissism of the president who styles himself most like a king. And it wouldn't be a Trump event without no-bid contracts and the sale of access. Corruption is par for the course at this point. I think the Trump show has jumped the shark. I don't think many people are tuning in because he's lost it. But more importantly, what we're seeing is how destabilized he is by his global humiliation in the Middle East, which he cannot deny or lie away. His approval rating sits at 34%, while Americans pay more than ever for groceries and health care and rent. And he's out here building a monument to himself and adorning his office in gold trim while, because of his actions, cancer patients face the loss of their health insurance. He has cemented his place in history in disgrace. And now our job as patriotic Americans inspired by the legacy of our founding is to marshal all of our passion and resources and energy to restoring checks and balances this fall, because we won't get another chance at this. And this race in Georgia will be decisive. I am the only incumbent Democratic senator running for re-election in a state that Donald Trump won. They will spend hundreds of millions of dollars to try to unseat me. And I'm asking folks to visit electjohn.com to support my effort.
One of the things you've worked very hard on is this housing bill that I started the show talking about. And this morning, this all happened in the same day. Sometimes you can't make it up in Washington. Trump just decided not to sign this bill. And instead, he demanded that your Republican colleagues move forward in essentially pushing a voter suppression bill forward. I have my own thoughts. I mentioned some of them. What do you think he pulled this all today?
Let's be very clear about what the president is saying to the American people. The president is saying that he will not sign a bill whose purpose is to make housing affordable unless his allies in Congress pass a voter suppression bill to rig the election. He's saying, I won't even sign a bill that will give economic relief to Americans unless the rules of this election are changed so that he, Donald Trump, cannot be held accountable for all of his misdeeds. Because that's what he really fears most of all, is that when there is a change in the balance of power and when we restore checks and balances, he knows that there will be subpoenas flying, that officials from his administration will be testifying under oath about the full range of misconduct and corruption that we already know has been happening since the moment he was sworn in.
He also today had a lunch with the Republican caucus. You mentioned a number of the things a number of them are pissed off at him about, including him trying to jam an $88 billion ask for money for the Iran war down their throats, pushing for this voter suppression bill, which there are not the votes for. He hasn't endorsed some sitting members of the Senate. I just played a little bit of YOLO John Cornyn, as I like to call him. What's going on with that? And do you think there are more opportunities to work with Republicans on some of the things that might be priorities to you and some of your colleagues?
Look, I've got good working relationships with a lot of Republican colleagues. That's how I've gotten so much done for Georgia, from passing landmark prison reform legislation to legislation that forces big tech companies to report online predators. And I know, because I talked to them, that many of them are furious, that many of them feel that the president has lost control and lost the plot. And yet, we cannot hold out hope for a sudden outbreak of courage and integrity on the part of this president's allies in Congress, because he's already blown through so many red lines, and they stand with him because they're afraid of him. It is only by winning decisively this fall and demonstrating to his allies that they put their seats and their political careers at risk by continuing to do his bidding that we will change their behavior.